Our next guest has proposed a new theory on what could have happened to Nancy Guthrie. We'll sum it up for you, but we warned that this may be difficult for some of people to hear. Our guest believes that whoever is writing TMZ with these notes and looking for Bitcoin in exchange for information is the person who took Nancy. He thinks this is all a burglary gone bad, where the attacker went in, was disturbed, and attacked Nancy, didn't realize she was going to be there, and needed to figure out what to do with her afterward because he wanted to move her before the sun was up, and he probably had about 2 hours to either decide to take her, hide her, or to dispose of her. That means she would be within 2 hours of her home. Now, to get into this theory with more about it, Jonathan Gilliam, who's a former FBI special agent and former U.S. Navy SEAL, this is his thoughts on what may have happened. Jonathan, I think this makes a lot of sense just given the nature of crime in Tucson and the way that things play out in that city. But give us a little more information about your summary and what you're thinking about the theory.
So when I came up with this, I started looking at, again, the totality of the circumstances. And Katie, I think it's important for everybody to know that I look at all the circumstances. This is one of many theories that I and other people have come up with. And of course, we don't have all the information that law enforcement has. So that's important caveat here. But when I started adding up the behavior of the individual when he was at the front door, which we see there in that picture, he was very, very comfortable at being there. He was not in a rush. He didn't look like he was in a panic because the camera saw him. And that's the way criminals who are comfortable doing these types of things, that's the way they are. But he also showed that he was not that bright in the way that he went and got some weeds and put it over the camera. It didn't really do a whole lot. A smarter, less comfortable criminal probably would have left at that point. So he could have been focused on her. And people are saying, well, he had a full backpack, so he couldn't have robbed anybody, but he could have 20 bags of some sort inside that backpack to fill up with stuff. So the more I looked at the timeline, the more it reflects on somebody who, when they got in there, disturbed Nancy. She woke up and they reacted, either injuring her or potentially killing her, and then sat in there for 40 minutes trying to figure out what to do. So at that point, it's got to be close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and you only have about 2 hours left until twilight, which is about 5:20 to 5:40 a.m. At that point in time. So at that point, I don't think they would want to be moving around with a hostage or a body in their car. And so most likely somewhere within 2 hours, I would think it may even be less, they have been there. And if this person had been somewhere with her or dispose of her body, that means that there will be 2 sets of DNA at that point. And then you would have a definitive match of a DNA and that is with her DNA. So I would go ahead.
What is your theory then about him being armed, and he was not carrying his firearm in a way that a professional would, or someone who's used to even carrying? He seemed uncomfortable and just kind of doing it in a way that he saw in a video game or something. But he was armed going into the home. So how does that play into the burglary theory?
Well, I mean, a lot of these people will carry firearms, and they do things. If you see videos of people sneaking in or going to a house to either steal something out of the mailbox or get into the house or a car, they have the same mannerisms as this individual. They just look like they're up to no good. They look like they're sneaking around, but typically they leave. So this individual may have, for whatever reason, because we don't know what happened after this part of the video, however he gained access into that house. So I'm not saying that she wasn't a target, but from what I've seen, as far as the way these types of criminals act, he was very calm and coordinated and cool about being there. And then he spent so much time in the house. I just don't think if he was trying to kidnap her.
He was in the house for a long time. He was there for a long time. Yeah.
But somebody who's panicked would. Somebody who's panicked would stay in the house for a while.
Interesting. So you mentioned the 2-hour time period of before the sun came up and wanting to get the situation at least under control or away from him. Mexico is 60 minutes from Tucson. It is right there. It was the middle of the night. What are your thoughts about the potential now that Nancy may be in Mexico and the FBI has been contacting authorities there to try and aid with the search?
Well, I think there's going to be a limited amount of places that this individual could go across and take a body across. It's going to have to be on a road. He's probably not going to be carrying a body across the border. There's plenty of places to cross the border, but there's not many places to cross the border with a body. So there
Unless
again,
he went through the reservation, and then you have hundreds of miles you can cross with it.
Hundreds of miles, but not 100 miles of road. That's the difference. So physically carrying a body across the road or across the border is going to be a tremendous effort for somebody. Taking them in a car is going to be a much different aspect. And even if they did go off road and take a dirt road or something like that, they would have to be familiar with that in order to get back into Mexico. And they're still taking a chance when you have a hostage or a body. I'm not saying they didn't go across Mexico. I'm just saying as you start to add these things up, it looks less and less likely that that's what occurred.
Yeah, and we just don't know. And I've been saying, cartels don't like things to be messy in their business, and this would make things very messy for them. But we still don't know what happened. So, Jonathan, we have to run, but thank you. Go ahead, one last thought.
If anybody is within those 2 hours on that morning before the sun came up, if they saw somebody doing something suspicious with somebody else within 2 hours of that location, I would report it.
Yeah, absolutely. All the leads, the better. Jonathan Gilliam, thank you so much.
You got it, Katie.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.